In a house where all the clocks stopped at the same time, a man vanished. What if his disappearance wasn't just a coincidence? The silence hit Detective Michael Hale like a physical force as he stepped through the threshold of 419, Blackwood Drive. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of an empty house, this was different, dense and oppressive, like being underwater. The November wind rattled bare branches against the windows, but inside, the stillness felt absolute. He'd investigated hundreds of missing persons cases over his 15 years with the department, but something about this one made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Professor James Riggs, a respected historian at the local university, had vanished 2 days ago, leaving his door locked from the inside. The report came from his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Livingston, who'd grown concerned when the usually predictable professor missed his daily morning walk and his house remained dark for 2 consecutive nights. Professor went out every morning at 7 sharp, Mrs. Livingston had told him earlier, wringing her hands. Rain or shine, like clockwork. Except Tuesday. Tuesday, his light stayed on all night, and then, nothing. The crime scene unit had already processed the house, finding no signs of forced entry. The door had indeed been locked from the inside, they'd had to call a locksmith to get in. Now, standing in the entrance hall, Michael noticed the first oddity that would come to define this case. The grandfather clock against the wall showed 3:17, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. He might not have thought anything of it, except that when he checked his phone to note the time of his arrival, the screen displayed the same numbers, 3:17. He tapped it, frowning. The seconds were still counting, but the hour and minutes remained fixed. A glitch, surely. Michael moved deeper into the house, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The living room looked ordinary at first glance, leather armchair, walls lined with bookshelves, a desk by the window covered in papers. But then he saw the antique mantel clock, 3:17. And the modern digital display on the coffee maker in the kitchen beyond, 3:17. "Hey, Roberts," he called out to the crime scene technician who was photographing the kitchen. "Did you notice anything weird about the clocks in here?" Roberts looked up from his camera. "You mean how they're all showing the same time?" "Yeah, every single one in the house. Even the professor's watch on his nightstand upstairs. Creepy, right?" Michael's hand instinctively went to his own watch. The hands pointed to 3:17. His stomach tightened. He'd checked the time before entering the house, it had been 2:43 p.m. He'd only been here about 10 minutes. The kitchen showed signs of interrupted routine. A half-empty coffee cup sat on the counter, a thin film of mold forming on its surface. The morning paper from Tuesday was spread open to the crossword, several squares filled in with precise handwriting. Nothing appeared disturbed or out of place. Upstairs, the professor's bedroom was equally unremarkable, the bed neatly made, clothes hanging in ordered rows in the closet. But the study told a different story. Books lay scattered across the floor, some open, pages bent. Papers covered the massive oak desk, many covered in the professor's increasingly erratic handwriting. Different from his neat crossword entries downstairs, these notes were rushed, almost frenzied. Among the chaos, a small leather-bound journal caught Michael's eye. He pulled on a latex glove and picked it up, careful not to disturb its position too much. The last entry was dated Tuesday. "They're watching. I can feel them now, in the walls, in the spaces between seconds. The artifact works, God help me, it works. But I never imagined the price. Everything I've studied, everything I've believed about time, we were all wrong. They'll come at 3:17. I have to." The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off in a jagged line. Michael felt a chill run down his spine, the kind of instinctive response he'd learned not to ignore over years of detective work. He pulled out his phone to photograph the page, but the screen remained stubbornly fixed on 3:17. A floorboard creaked behind him. Michael spun around, hand moving automatically to his holstered weapon. The doorway was empty, but for a moment, just a fraction of a second, he could have sworn he saw a shadow move across the wall, like someone passing by in the hallway. But that was impossible. Roberts was still downstairs, and no one else was in the house. "Roberts," he called out anyway. His voice sounded strange, muffled, as if the air itself was too thick to carry sound properly. "Yeah." The response came from below, confirming what he already knew: he was alone up here. Michael turned back to the desk, his eye caught by a stack of papers partially hidden under a leather-bound volume of historical records. He slid them out carefully. They appeared to be research notes, covered in the professor's more typical neat handwriting, not the frantic scrawl of his final journal entry. The notes detailed something called the chronolith, described as an ancient timekeeping device supposedly discovered in the ruins of a forgotten civilization. According to the professor's research, the artifact had been lost for centuries until it resurfaced at an estate sale in Boston 3 months ago. The seller clearly had no idea what they had, Riggs had written. The markings matched the descriptions perfectly: the intricate gearwork, the strange symbols that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. All these years searching, and it literally fell into my lap for $50 at a yard sale. I can hardly believe my luck. The next several pages contain detailed sketches of what looked like an ornate pocket watch, its face covered in swirling symbols that made Michael's eyes hurt if he looked at them too long. The professor's notes grew increasingly excited as the pages went on, talking about temporal resonance and intersecting time streams. A sudden bang from downstairs made him jump. "Everything okay down there?" he shouted. No response. "Roberts?" The silence that followed felt different from before, expectant, almost alive. Michael drew his weapon and moved toward the stairs, keeping his back to the wall. The temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees in the last few minutes, his breath now visible in small clouds. He found Robert standing motionless in the kitchen, his camera hanging forgotten at his side, staring at the coffee maker's digital display. "What happened?" "I heard a noise." Roberts turned slowly, his face pale. "The time changed." "What?" "I've been documenting all the clocks showing 3:17, right? But just now, they all switched to 2:59. All of them, at exactly the same moment. And they're counting up." Michael looked at his phone. 2:59, as he watched, it clicked over to 3 o'clock. "Pack up," he said. "We're leaving. Now." But before Roberts could move, all the lights in the house flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. In the sudden quiet, Michael heard something that made his blood run cold: the soft tick of dozens of clocks, all perfectly synchronized, counting down to 3:17. Michael fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. "Roberts?" No answer. He swept the light across the kitchen, but the crime scene tech was gone. The space where he'd been standing moments ago was empty, as if he'd never been there at all. The ticking grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Michael's training told him to call for backup, to get out of the house and secure the scene. But when he tried his radio, it produced only static. His phone showed no signal, the screen still frozen at 3:01. A shuffling sound drew his attention to the living room. Moving cautiously, weapon raised, he followed the noise. The beam of his flashlight revealed nothing out of place, but the temperature had dropped even further. His breath came out in thick white clouds now, and frost was beginning to form on the windows, impossible on what had been a mild autumn afternoon. Something caught his eye on the professor's desk, a new paper that hadn't been there before, covered in fresh ink that glistened in the flashlight beam. The handwriting was different from Riggs', more angular and precise. "Time isn't what you think, Detective Hale. It's not a river flowing in one direction, it's an ocean, with depths and currents you can't begin to comprehend." The professor understood, in the end. "And soon, so will you." The paper was still wet, the ink spreading at the corners. Michael reached out to touch it, then jerked his hand back as the words began to move, rearranging themselves before his eyes. "Look behind you." He spun around, gun raised, but the beam of his flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, he heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate steps coming down from the second floor. But there was something wrong about the sound, as if it was playing in reverse. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime, though its hands still showed 3:03. 1, 2, 3. Each toll seemed to vibrate through Michael's bones, making his teeth ache. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed something that turned his blood to ice. Shadows were moving on the walls, but they weren't being cast by anything in the room. They twisted and writhed like living things, forming shapes that hurt his mind to look at. "Hello," he called out, hating how uncertain his voice sounded. "This is the police. Identify yourself." A whisper came from directly behind him, so close he could feel cold breath on his neck. "Time to see what's on the other side, detective." Michael whirled around, but his feet wouldn't move properly. The air had become thick as syrup, and his movements were sluggish, dreamlike. The shadows on the walls were solidifying, taking on three-dimensional form. As they peeled themselves away from the surface, he could see that they were vaguely human-shaped, but wrong. Their proportions were off, and they moved in ways that defied physics, like video footage being played backwards and forwards simultaneously. The temperature plummeted further. Ice crystals formed in the air, hanging suspended like frozen stars. The ticking of the clocks had reached a crescendo, but now it was starting to slow down, the sound stretching out impossibly long between each tick. Michael tried to move toward the door, but his legs wouldn't respond. The shadow figures were closing in, their edges blurring and shifting, reaching out with hands that weren't quite hands. 3:15 showed his phone's display. Then 3:16. In the final moments before 3:17, Michael saw something that his mind rejected even as his eyes registered it, a door that hadn't been there before, standing free in the middle of the room. It was old, made of dark wood and carved with the same twisted symbols he'd seen in the professor's sketches. And it was opening, revealing not the rest of the room behind it, but something else entirely, a space between spaces, where the laws of physics had no meaning. A figure stood in the doorway, backlit by what looked like the night sky, but the stars were all wrong, moving in impossible patterns. As it stepped forward, Michael recognized Professor Riggs, but changed. He looked both older and younger somehow, his face bearing an expression of mingled terror and ecstasy. "I tried to warn them," Riggs said, his voice echoing strangely, as if coming from very far away. "But they wouldn't listen. The chronolith isn't just a device for measuring time, it's a key. And now the door is open, detective. They're coming through." The shadow figures were pressing closer now, their forms rippling like smoke underwater. Michael's flashlight flickered back to life, but the beam seemed to bend around the entities, creating impossible patterns of light and darkness. He could feel something pulling at him, not physically but somehow deeper, as if the very atoms of his body were being drawn toward that impossible doorway. "What are they?" he managed to ask, his voice distorted by the thick air. Riggs smiled, an expression that didn't quite fit his face. "Time's guardians. Or its predators. I'm still not sure. But they've been waiting, detective. Waiting for someone to open the door again." A high-pitched whine filled the air, making Michael's ears pop. The hands on every clock in the house began to spin wildly, first forward, then backward, then in directions that shouldn't have been possible. The shadow figures were almost upon them now, their not quite hands reaching out with fingers that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once. "The artifact," Michael said, fighting against the temporal distortion that made each word feel like it took hours to speak. "Where is it? Where isn't it?" Riggs laughed, the sound fracturing into echoes that bounced off walls that weren't there. "Time isn't linear anymore, detective. The chronolith exists at every moment simultaneously. Just like them." He gestured to the shadow figures. "Just like us, soon." Michael's police training hadn't prepared him for this, but years of detective work had taught him to look for patterns, to find connections even when reality didn't make sense. He forced himself to focus, to think through the impossible situation logically. The professor's notes had mentioned temporal resonance. The clocks had all stopped at 3:17, then reset to 2:59. The shadow figures seemed to move in and out of time itself. And that door, it wasn't just a portal through space. "You found it at the estate sale," he said slowly, each word a struggle against the thickening air. "But that's not the whole story, is it? Someone wanted you to find it." Something flickered across Riggs' face, a moment of clarity breaking through whatever had taken hold of him. "Yes," he whispered. "Laura tried to warn me. She knew what would happen because she'd seen it before." "Laura? Laura King?" Michael remembered the name from the phone records he'd checked earlier. "Your student?" "Former student," Riggs corrected. "She came to my office last week, terrified. Said she'd been having dreams about this moment. About the door opening. She said her grandmother had owned the chronolith once, decades ago. It drove her mad. She got rid of it at that estate sale, but they followed her anyway. The shadows. They always follow." The whining sound increased in pitch until it was almost unbearable. The door in the middle of the room was opening wider, revealing glimpses of what lay beyond, vast geometric shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves, streams of time flowing like rivers through an endless void. The shadow figures were moving toward it, pulling both men with them. "We have to close it," Michael shouted over the noise. "Professor, how do we close the door?" But Riggs wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had gone distant, fixed on something Michael couldn't see. "Beautiful, isn't it? The true shape of time. All moments existing simultaneously, eternal and infinite. We were so wrong, thinking it was just a straight line from past to future. It's everywhere, everything, all at once. And they live in the spaces between moments, watching, waiting." The professor took a step toward the door, his movements jerky and unnatural. The shadow figures parted to let him pass, their forms rippling with what might have been anticipation. Michael lunged forward, trying to grab him, but his hand passed through Riggs' arm as if it were made of smoke. "Don't," he called out. "Whatever's through there, whatever they're offering, it's not worth it." Riggs turned back one last time, and for a moment he looked like himself again, just a tired old professor who'd discovered something too big to handle. "It's too late, detective. The door is open. Time is broken. And they're hungry." With those words, Riggs stepped through the doorway. For a split second, Michael saw his figure silhouetted against that impossible space beyond, his form stretching and distorting like a reflection in troubled water. Then he was gone, leaving only a fading echo of his last words hanging in the air. The shadow figures turned their attention to Michael. He could feel their focus like a physical weight, pressing against his mind. The air had become so thick it was like trying to breathe underwater. His phone displayed 3:16, the numbers burning bright enough to leave afterimages in his vision. Fighting against the temporal distortion, Michael forced himself to move. He stumbled toward the professor's desk, drawn by an instinct he couldn't explain. The shadow figures followed, but slowly, almost leisurely, as if they knew he had nowhere to go. Among the scattered papers, something caught his eye, a small leather pouch he hadn't noticed before. Inside was an object that made his eyes hurt to look at, an antique pocket watch, its surface covered in the same twisted symbols from Riggs' sketches. The chronolith. The moment his fingers touched it, the world seemed to shift. The shadows recoiled, their forms rippling with what might have been fear. The watch was ice-cold in his hand, vibrating with a frequency he could feel in his teeth. Its face showed 3:16, but the hands were moving erratically, spinning in different directions as if unable to decide which way time should flow. A memory surfaced, something Laura King had said when he'd interviewed her earlier: "Time isn't just what we experience. It's like an iceberg, we only see the tip, the simple forward progression. But underneath, it's vast and complex. The chronolith doesn't just measure time, detective. It navigates it. The shadow figures were closing in again, more cautiously now. Through the open doorway, Michael could see shapes moving in that otherworldly space, things his mind refused to process. The pull toward the door was getting stronger, and he could feel his grip on reality starting to slip. But the chronolith in his hand seemed to pulse with its own kind of energy, fighting against the door's influence. Understanding dawned on him, the artifact wasn't just a key to open the door. It was also the lock. "That's why you need it, isn't it?" he said to the shadows. "You can't stay here without it. You can't maintain your connection to our time stream." The entities didn't respond in words, but the air vibrated with their reaction. The temperature dropped even further, frost spreading across the floor in fractal patterns. The door began to pulse with dark energy, its edges bleeding into reality like ink in water. Michael's fingers found a catch on the side of the watch. It sprang open, revealing intricate gearwork that moved in ways that defied physics. At its center was a small crystal that seemed to contain an entire universe of swirling lights. The shadow figures surged forward all at once, their forms merging into a wave of darkness. But Michael had already made his decision. With all his strength, he hurled the chronolith through the doorway into that impossible space beyond. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the crystal at the heart of the device shattered. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The shadow figures writhed in silent agony as their connection to our reality began to break down. The door itself started to collapse, its edges curling inward like burning paper. The air filled with a sound like breaking glass, but slowed down 1,000 times. Michael felt something tear inside his mind as temporal forces warred around him. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the door folding in on itself, taking the shadow figures with it. Then darkness claimed him. He awoke to the sound of birds singing and early morning light streaming through the windows. He was lying on the floor of Professor Riggs' study, surrounded by scattered papers and books. His head throbbed, and his memories of what had happened were already starting to feel dreamlike and uncertain. His phone showed 7:30 a.m., Wednesday. Almost 12 hours had passed, or had they? When he checked the call logs and messages from the previous day, he found nothing about the case. No record of his conversations with Laura King or Mrs. Livingston. Even his initial dispatch to 419, Blackwood Drive was missing. The house looked different in the morning light, just an ordinary academic's home, cluttered but unremarkable. All the clocks were working normally, showing the correct time. There was no door standing in the middle of the room, no frost on the windows, no sign of the temporal disturbance he remembered. But there were changes, subtle ones that made him question his own sanity. The professor's journal was gone, along with all his research notes about the chronolith. The books scattered across the floor were different, standard history texts, nothing about temporal physics or ancient artifacts. Even the coffee cup in the kitchen had vanished. Michael spent the next week trying to piece together what had happened. He tracked down Laura King, but the woman he found looked nothing like the student he remembered interviewing. This Laura was in her 50s, a professor herself now. When he mentioned James Riggs, she went pale. "My grandmother knew him," she said quietly. "Back in the 1970s, when she was a student. He disappeared under mysterious circumstances, something about a pocket watch he'd found. The police never solved the case." She hesitated, then added, "I used to have dreams about it, when I was younger. About shadows that moved wrong, and a door that shouldn't exist." Mrs. Livingston was equally puzzling. The elderly neighbor he remembered had apparently died 15 years ago. Her house was now occupied by a young family who'd never heard of Professor Riggs. The official investigation stalled quickly. Without any evidence of a crime, or even proof that James Riggs had lived in the house recently, there was nothing to pursue. Michael's superiors grew concerned about his insistence that something supernatural had occurred. Eventually, he stopped talking about it, but he never stopped searching for answers. He returned to 419 Blackwood Drive many times over the following months, always at different hours, always hoping to find some trace of what he'd experienced. The house remained stubbornly ordinary, its clocks keeping perfect time, its shadows behaving exactly as shadows should. But sometimes, in the quiet hours near 317, he would catch glimpses of something from the corner of his eye, a flicker of movement that didn't quite match reality, a shadow that seemed to move against the light. And on rare occasions, he would hear something that might have been ticking, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. 1 year to the day after his experience, Michael received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single page torn from what looked like an old journal. The handwriting was familiar, the same angular script he'd seen form on the professor's desk that night. The message was brief. "Time isn't broken anymore, detective." But it was never whole to begin with. The doors are still there, hidden in the spaces between seconds. And they're still watching. They're always watching. The paper disintegrated in his hands as he read it, crumbling to dust that vanished before it hit the ground. When he checked his phone to document the incident, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The display showed 317. Michael Hale continued his work as a detective, solving ordinary cases with logical explanations. But he never forgot what he'd learned in that house on Blackwood Drive, that time isn't just a simple progression from past to future, but something far more complex and dangerous. That there are things living in the cracks between moments, things that hunger for more than just time. And sometimes, late at night, he finds himself wondering about Professor Riggs. Is he still out there somewhere, lost in that geometric void beyond the door? Or does he exist in all moments simultaneously now, another guardian or predator of time itself? The house at 419 Blackwood Drive still stands, looking perfectly ordinary to passers-by. Inside, the clocks tick steadily, marking time in the usual way. But if you listen carefully, you might hear something else beneath that regular rhythm, a different kind of ticking, counting down to a moment that exists outside of time itself. Some say that on quiet nights, when the moon is dark and the wind blows just right, all the clocks in the house still stop at 317. And in those frozen moments, if you look through the windows, you might see shadows moving in ways that shadows shouldn't, gathering around a door that both exists and doesn't, waiting for someone else to turn the key. But whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain: Detective Michael Hale will never look at a clock the same way again. Because he knows now that time isn't just passing. It's watching.